In this Unit 1 grammar tutorial, we'll focus on sentences. What is a sentence and what's it for? The answer to the first question will account for the bulk of this tutorial. But the answer to the second question, what's a sentence for, is simple: to communicate a thought. In this tutorial, we'll learn to identify common problems in the construction of a complete sentence and effective ways to fix or to edit those problems. Now that we know what a sentence is for, let's start to make sense of what a sentence is and what a sentence is not. The essential ingredients of a complete sentence are a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. The subject of a sentence is a noun or pronoun. Here's an example sentence from Anne Bernay's Warrior Day, which appears in our textbook, Back to the Lake. The Marine Brass Band played beautifully. In this sentence, the complete subject is the Marine Brass Band. The simple subject, without any descriptive words or modifiers, is band. The verb in this sentence is played. What did the Marine Brass Band do? It played. The subject-verb combination is the heart of the sentence. To be sure that a sentence is grammatically correct, we must ensure that it contains a complete thought. The Marine Brass Band played beautifully is a complete thought. If we were to begin the sentence with the word if or because, a subordinator or start of a dependent clause, we would not have a complete thought. Instead, we would have a sentence fragment. A sentence fragment is an incomplete sentence. While subject fragments may do the job in an informal situation, as part of a print ad or text message, they are not appropriate for academic essays or other formal writing situations. This section will help you to identify sentence fragments. One common cause of a complete sentence is a missing subject. What a delightful life they led. Attended the best schools. The second sentence here is a fragment. The author doesn't tell us who attended the best schools. Another common culprit is the missing verb. What a delightful life they led. The best schools. In the second sentence, the author neglects to tell us what happened at the best schools. That sentence is a fragment. Perhaps the most common cause of a sentence fragment is the use of a dependent thought in place of a complete thought. What a delightful life they led, since they had everything they ever wanted. In the second of the two sentences here, they is the subject and had is the verb. But this subject-verb combination is preceded by since, a subordinating word which makes this a dependent clause, or a group of words that depends on a main clause or independent clause to form a complete sentence. A dependent clause on its own is a sentence fragment. Now that you can identify a sentence fragment, what can you do to edit or fix it? If you've identified a sentence fragment that is missing a subject, simply add a subject. Here's an example. the writer initially wrote the following: "What a delightful life they led, attended the best schools." Since the second sentence is missing a subject, we can add "their children" before the verb attended to form a new and complete subject-verb combination and to fix the fragment. Similarly, if you have identified a fragment that excludes a verb, simply add an appropriate verb or a complete predicate, which tells us what the subject is or does. The author of these two sentences initially wrote, "What a delightful life they led, the best schools." We can edit this fragment by adding a verb or a complete predicate. The best schools offered academic scholarships. When you find a fragment in the form of a dependent clause, perhaps the easiest way to repair the fragment is to remove the subordinating word that makes the sentence a fragment. Take a look at this example. What a delightful life they led, since they had everything they ever wanted. The error appears in the second sentence, which begins with the subordinating word since. If we remove the word, the sentence is no longer a dependent clause or a fragment. It's now a complete thought. They had everything they ever wanted. Another way to repair a fragment that lacks a complete thought is to attach the dependent clause to a nearby sentence. We have the same sentence fragment here in the original version of the second sentence. Since they had everything they ever wanted. This fragment, beginning with the word since, has a close relationship with the sentence that comes before it. What a delightful life they led. In fact, the subordinating word since highlights the cause and effect relationship between the sentences. Why not combine the two sentences and make a new, complete sentence? What a delightful life they led, since they had everything they ever wanted. Note that we omit a comma when the dependent clause follows the main clause. If it's the other way around, the dependent clause comes first, we offset the main clause from the dependent clause with a comma, as in the following example. When my mother and father changed the subject, comma, I changed it back. The subordinating word at the beginning of the dependent clause here is when. Since the dependent clause comes first and the main clause follows, we use a comma to offset the clauses. Comma splices and fused sentences both come under the more general heading of run-on sentences. If you're like most students, the phrase run-on may suggest a sentence that is too long. That's not quite right, though. A sentence can be any length, as long as it's grammatical. The problem with run-on sentences, whether they be comma splices or fused sentences, is the topic of the next section of this tutorial. First, a comma splice occurs if you join two independent thoughts, or independent clauses, with just a comma. The comma doesn't provide your reader with enough of a break between the two clauses. We call this type of sentence error a comma splice, because the two clauses are incorrectly joined or spliced together. Here's an example. He dug the grave in the backyard with a shovel borrowed from a neighbor, comma, my father had soft hands and they blistered easily. A run-on sentence with nearly the same problem appears if the two independent clauses are joined with nothing at all, not even a comma. He dug the grave in the backyard with a shovel borrowed from a neighbor. My father had soft hands, and they blistered easily. The reader will stumble upon the second thought, or independent clause, and become confused. Fortunately, we can apply a simple editing process to correct both comma splices and fused sentences. One way to fix a run-on sentence, whether it's a comma splice or fused sentence, is to simply make two sentences. Add a period between the two thoughts and capitalize the beginning of the new second sentence. Here's an example. He dug the grave in the backyard with a shovel borrowed from a neighbor. Period. My father had soft hands, and they blistered easily. A good way to fix a run-on sentence and to add clarity at the same time is to use a comma and a coordinating conjunction between the two independent thoughts. The complete list of coordinating conjunctions contains the words and, or, but, so, yet, nor, and for. Let's take a look at the editing process for a comma splice or fused sentence using this method. The original sentence is a comma splice because a comma alone cannot join two independent thoughts. To edit the comma splice, use a comma followed by the coordinating conjunction but. He dug the grave in the backyard with a shovel borrowed from a neighbor, comma, but my father had soft hands, and they blistered easily. Not only have we corrected the comma splice, we've also clarified the relationship between the two thoughts. The word but at the start of the second clause tells the reader that the second thought is a departure from the first. We call this sentence type coordination because we give equal weight to each idea in the sentence. For more on coordination, review chapter S8 in the Little Seagull Handbook. Another way to link two independent thoughts in a single sentence using coordination is to place a semicolon between the two clauses. We should use this method only when we don't need a coordinating conjunction, and, but, or, so, yet, for, or nor, to signal the relationship. Try to restrict the use of this sentence pattern to sentences that combine two closely related thoughts. Here's an example. He dug the grave in the backyard with a shovel borrowed from a neighbor, semicolon. My father had soft hands, and they blistered easily. If we think the two thoughts in the sentence are closely related, or that the reader won't be confused by the combination, we can use the semicolon to offset the two clauses. Finally, a third method for editing a comma splice or fused sentence is to make one of the two sentences a dependent or subordinate clause. Here's an example. Although my father had soft hands that blistered easily, comma, he dug the grave in the backyard with a shovel borrowed from a neighbor. By adding the subordinating word although to the first half of the new sentence, we clarify the relationship between the two thoughts and correct the run-on. We call this sentence type subordination, because one idea is more important than the other. For more on subordination, review chapter S8 in the Little Seagull Handbook. Some of the examples that appear in this presentation were borrowed from the EN 101 textbook Back to the Lake, published by Norton. Thanks for viewing.